Thus Mountain Man found a tree with a strange lump, but when he cut it open, the axe hit metal, sparks flew. Inside that tree was no ordinary knot of wood, but a rusted iron box holding letters from a dying mother, a silver cross, and a deed to land every rancher in the valley would kill to own. He thought he was alone in the mountains forever, but then he found the girl those letters spoke of, half-starved, half Apache, clutching the only thing left of her family. Now the town whispers, the cattlemen circle, the sheriff rattles his jail keys, and the church bell tolls like judgment. The Mountain Man must decide, stay hidden in silence, or risk everything to protect the girl who calls him father. When the bullets fly and the truth is read aloud before the whole town, will mercy win? Or will greed burn them both to ash? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The axe bit deep into the frozen wood, sending splinters flying in the fading mountain light. Donald Braddock paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his breath forming clouds in the cold Colorado air. Winter was coming early this year. He could smell it in the wind that whistled through the pines surrounding his lonely cabin. His gaze settled on a tall pine tree with an odd bulge in its trunk, like a giant knot pushing against the bark. Something about it caught his eye. In all his years working timber in these highlands, he'd never seen growth quite like that. Might as well take that one next, he muttered to himself, voice rough from disuse. Living alone in the mountains didn't call for much talking. The familiar rhythm of chopping filled the air as Donald worked. Thunk, thunk. The tree's trunk slowly gave way under his steady strikes. When it finally began to lean, he stepped back, watching as it crashed to the ground with a sound like distant thunder. As he began splitting the trunk for kindling, his axe struck something hard. Definitely not wood. A spray of sparks lit up the growing dusk. Donald frowned, running calloused fingers over the spot where metal had met metal. What in tarnation? He worked more carefully now, using the axe to pry apart the wood around whatever was buried in the heart of the pine. The trunk split to reveal an iron box, dark with rust, wedged deep inside as if the tree had grown around it. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the box free. It wasn't very large, about the size of a Bible, but it had some weight to it. The lock had long since rusted through, leaving only a rough hole where it had once been. Night was falling fast now. Donald gathered his split wood and the mysterious box, carrying them back to his cabin. The familiar creak of the door welcomed him home to the one-room shelter he'd built with his own hands 15 years ago, back when Sarah was still alive. He pushed that thought away quickly like he always did. No good dwelling on the past. A lamp cast warm light across the rough wooden table as Donald settled into his chair. The box sat before him, its secrets waiting to be revealed. Part of him wanted to throw it in the fire without opening it. He'd learned the hard way that some mysteries were better left alone, but something made him hesitate. With careful fingers, he worked the rusted lid open. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a bundle of papers, letters by the look of them, and something wrapped in faded cloth. The paper was stained and delicate, but the writing was still clear enough to read. Donald moved closer to the lamp, squinting at the careful script. My dearest friend, if you are reading this, then I am gone and my Mariah needs help. She is 14 now. Part Apache, part mine. Holy gods. I pray someone kind will find these letters and see that justice is done. Donald's throat tightened. He didn't want to read more, didn't want to care about some stranger's troubles. He'd had enough grief of his own. But his eyes kept moving across the words anyway. He unwrapped the cloth bundle with gentle hands, revealing a silver cross on a delicate chain. It caught the firelight, sending soft gleams dancing across the cabin walls. There was something else, too. A folded document that turned out to be a deed to land down by the river written in precise legal language. The rest of the letters told a story that made his chest ache. A dying mother's words to her daughter. Warnings about people who might try to steal what was rightfully hers. Prayers for protection. Love poured out in ink and paper, sealed away in iron and wood. Donald carefully returned everything to the box except for the cross, that he left on the table, where it seemed to glow with a light of its own in the fire's warmth. Sleep wouldn't come that night. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind in the pines. The cross gleamed softly in the dying firelight, reminding him of another silver cross that Sarah had worn, the one he'd buried with her and their little Ruth when the fever took them both. He rolled over, trying to shut out the memories, but they came anyway. Sarah's gentle voice reading from her Bible in the evenings. Ruth's laughter as she chased butterflies outside their cabin. The terrible silence after they were gone. And now here was another story of loss literally growing inside a tree all these years. A girl named Mariah, carrying Apache blood and her mother's prayers. Someone who needed help, according to those water-stained letters. "I don't want any part of this," Donald whispered to the darkness. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. 15 years of solitude had built walls around his heart, but they weren't as solid as he'd thought. The discovery of that iron box had already started something moving inside him, like spring thaw in a frozen stream. He got up and added wood to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The cross still lay on the table where he'd left it, catching bits of firelight like stars. Dawn would come soon enough. He should try to sleep. But Donald knew he wouldn't. Not with these new ghosts keeping him company. Not with the weight of a mother's last wishes pressing on his conscience. Not with memories of his own losses rising up like mist from the valley. The wind picked up outside, making the cabin's timbers creak. It was going to be a long night, full of questions he didn't want to ask, and answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. The silver cross kept its quiet vigil on the table, waiting for whatever morning would bring. Donald sat in his chair, watching it gleam, while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in the cold mountain sky. He thought about the girl mentioned in the letters, Mariah. Somewhere out there, she was carrying half of two worlds inside her, just trying to find her place. The thought stirred something he'd thought long dead, a protective instinct, a desire to help. "No," he said aloud, his voice harsh in the quiet cabin. "I ain't getting involved. I can't." But the cross caught the firelight again, sending another shimmer across the wall, and Donald knew he was lying to himself. The discovery of that box had already changed things. Like it or not, he was part of the story now. He picked up the first letter again, reading it more slowly this time. The mother's words were full of both love and worry. Worry about what would happen to her daughter in a world that wasn't always kind to those who carried mixed blood in their veins. The deed to the Riverside land was clearly valuable. Prime grazing territory with good water access. No wonder the mother had been concerned about people trying to steal it. Land like that could make a man rich, might or get him killed. Donald ran his fingers over the rough iron of the box, wondering how it had come to be inside that tree. Someone must have put it there for safekeeping, planning to return but never making it back. The tree had grown around it, keeping its secrets for who knew how many years until his axe had found it. The night grew deeper. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling like lonely spirits. Donald added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair. Sleep wasn't coming anyway. Might as well keep reading. He worked his way through the rest of the letters, piecing together more of the story. The mother had been a settler, the father an Apache man who died in a dispute with cattle rustlers. The girl, Mariah, had been raised with both her mother's Christian faith and her father's Apache traditions. The mother's illness had come on suddenly, leaving her just enough time to hide the box and write these letters. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cabin's single window, Donald finally set the letters aside. His eyes were tired, but his mind was racing. He'd come to these mountains to escape the complications of the world below, to live a simple life of solitude after losing everything he loved. Now it seemed the world had found him anyway, bringing with it a mystery and a responsibility he hadn't asked for. The silver cross still lay on the table, catching the first rays of morning sun. Donald picked it up, letting the chain run through his fingers. It was a fine piece of work, probably a family heirloom. He could sell it in the town for a good price, enough to buy supplies for the whole winter. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't do it. That cross belonged to someone, to this Mariah girl, wherever she was. And those letters, that deed to the Riverside land, they were her rightful inheritance. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Donald stood and stretched his tired muscles, walking to the window. The mountains were touched with pink and gold now as the sun rose over the peaks. Another day was beginning, but it wasn't just another day. Something had shifted in his world, as surely as that tree had fallen. He looked back at the iron box and its contents spread across his table, the physical pieces of a story he hadn't asked to be part of, but couldn't simply ignore, not if he wanted to live with himself. The morning light grew stronger, chasing the shadows from the cabin's corners. Donald Braddock stood at his window, watching the sun rise over his mountain home, knowing that his life of solitude was about to change. He just didn't know how much. Morning light streamed through Donald's cabin window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. He sat at his table, the letters spread before him, reading them again with clearer eyes after his sleepless night. His coffee grew cold, forgotten as the words drew him deeper into their story. To whoever finds this, the mother's writing pleaded, her script growing shakier with each page. I beg you to protect my Mariah. The land deed is her birthright, her father's legacy. Don't let them take it from her because of her mixed blood. She carries the best of both worlds in her heart. Donald's hands trembled as he folded the last letter. The woman's desperate love for her daughter reminded him too much of Sarah's final days, when the fever had taken hold. He'd made promises then too, whispered them into the night as he watched his wife and child slip away. He stood abruptly, pushing back from the table. The morning was getting on, and sitting here wouldn't solve anything. With practiced movements, he gathered his gear and stepped outside to saddle his old mule, Jenny. Reckon we're heading to town, girl, he murmured, tightening the cinch. The mule's ears flicked back at his voice, probably the first words he'd spoken aloud in days. The trail down from his cabin wound treacherous and steep. Jenny picked her way carefully over loose shale and exposed roots while Donald's mind wandered to places he usually avoided. About 3 hours down the mountain, they passed the overgrown path that led to his old homestead. Somewhere in that tangle of wild roses lay 2 graves he hadn't visited in 15 years. Not today, he whispered, but the memories came anyway. Sarah reading her Bible by lamplight. Little Ruth learning to walk, tottering across the cabin floor. The awful silence after they were gone. Jenny's sure hooves brought them into town near midday. The settlement had grown some since his last visit months ago. New buildings going up on the north end, more traffic on the dusty main street. Donald dismounted stiffly, leading Jenny to the water trough outside the general store. The church stood at the far end of town, a simple white-painted building with a tin cross catching the sun. Donald had never paid it much mind before, but today he headed straight for it, the silver cross indeed heavy in his coat pocket. He found Reverend Harlan in his small study behind the church, bent over a leather-bound Bible. The preacher looked up as Donald entered, surprise crossing his weathered face. Well, if it isn't the mountain man himself, Harlan said, rising to shake Donald's hand. Been a while since you've graced us with your presence, brother. Donald nodded, uncomfortable with the warm welcome he didn't feel he deserved. Without preamble, he pulled out the cross and deed, laying them on the preacher's desk. Found these up in my woods. In a tree. Reverend Harlan picked up the cross, turning it in the light. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Lord, have mercy, he breathed. I know this cross. You do? Saw it about 6 months back hanging around the neck of a girl. Half Apache child. The preacher's face darkened. Some local boys ran her off, calling her names that'd shame their mothers. She came to the church door asking for food, but they chased her away before I could help. Donald's hands clenched at his sides. You know where she went? There's been talk of someone living rough down by the river past Walker's old place. Harlan carefully set the cross down. Been meaning to ride out there myself, but my circuit riding keeps me busy. You thinking of looking for her? Might, Donald said, not meeting the preacher's knowing look. Those who show mercy to orphans are doing the Lord's work, Harlan said quietly. Just saying. Donald gathered the items back into his pocket. Much obliged for the information, Reverend. He spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries around town. The general store owner had caught someone stealing dried beans 2 weeks ago, but hadn't gotten a good look. The blacksmith's wife mentioned missing clothes from her washing line. Walker, whose farm bordered the river, complained about snares in his rabbit hutches. Dirty thief, the farmer spat. Catch 'em at it, they'll wish they'd never come round here. Donald said nothing, but his jaw tightened at the man's tone. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when he finally led Jenny down the overgrown path to the river. The evening air carried the scent of water and wild sage, and somewhere ahead, a girl's voice rose in song. He couldn't make out the words, they might have been Apache or maybe English, but the melody spoke of loneliness and endurance. Donald tied Jenny to a cottonwood and moved carefully through the brush, following the sound. The river bent sharply here, creating a natural hollow in the bank. Willow thickets provided good cover, and he spotted clever use of driftwood, creating a makeshift shelter. The singing stopped abruptly as he approached. "I know you're there," a young voice called out. "I heard your horse and a mule, actually," Donald said, keeping his voice gentle. "I ain't here to cause trouble." A figure emerged from the willows, a thin girl of about 14 wearing a patched dress too big for her frame. Her black hair was tied back with a faded ribbon, and her features showed the clear blend of two peoples. In her hands, she gripped a rabbit snare like a weapon. "You're Mariah," Donald said. It wasn't a question, he'd seen her mother's words describing her, but the reality of this brave, wounded child struck him hard. The girl's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. "How do you know my name?" Slowly, carefully, Donald reached into his coat pocket. The silver cross caught the last rays of sunset as he held it out. "I believe this belongs to you." Mariah stared at the cross, her composure cracking for just a moment. In that brief flash, Donald saw past her defensive walls to the grieving daughter beneath. She took a step forward, then caught herself. "Where did you get that?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Found it in a box, inside a tree up on my mountain." Donald kept his hand extended, letting her see he meant no threat. "There were letters, too. From your mother." A small sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a sob. The rabbit snare dropped forgotten as she moved closer, drawn by the sight of her mother's cross. When she reached for it, Donald saw the marks of hard living on her young hands, calluses, scratches, the raw determination of survival. "It's really mine," she whispered, touching the silver surface. "I thought I'd lost it forever when they made me run." The setting sun painted the river gold and crimson, a beautiful sight that neither of them noticed. In that moment, their whole world had narrowed to a silver cross passing from one scarred hand to another. A simple object that carried the weight of memory, loss, and perhaps something like hope. Donald held the silver cross steady in the fading light, its surface catching the last rays of sun. "Your mother left this for you," he said softly, "along with some letters." Mariah's eyes widened as she stepped forward, her thin fingers reaching out to touch the familiar object. With trembling hands, she took the cross and clutched it to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. "Mama's cross," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She wore it every day, even when she was so sick at the end. Her thumb traced the worn patterns in the silver, a gesture that spoke of long familiarity. Donald reached into his coat and pulled out one of the water-stained letters. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, careful not to tear the delicate edges. "Would you like to hear what she wrote?" Mariah nodded, not taking her eyes off the cross. "To whoever finds this," Donald read, his rough voice gentling around the words, "I entrust my greatest treasure, my daughter Mariah. She is part Apache, part mine, holy gods. The land deed enclosed is her rightful inheritance, though there are those who would deny it. I beg you, protect her, guide her, let her know she was loved beyond measure." He lowered the letter, watching Mariah's face carefully. She stood perfectly still, like a young deer ready to bolt. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you bother helping me?" "Nobody else has." Donald shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the direct question. "Truth is, I don't rightly know," he admitted. "But your mother's words, they felt like a command I couldn't ignore. Something about them wouldn't let me rest." Mariah studied him with dark eyes that seemed far older than her 14 years. "You found these in a tree?" "Lightning struck pine up on my mountain, box was grown right into it." He gestured toward the highlands rising behind them. "I've got a cabin up there. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. Safer than sleeping rough down here." "How do I know I can trust you?" Her hand tightened around the cross. "You don't," Donald said simply. "But winter's coming. Won't be long before night frosts hit these lowlands. Up higher, I've got shelter, food stored away. Your choice, but the offer's there. Mariah glanced at her makeshift camp, then back at Donald. The silence stretched between them as she weighed her options. Finally, she gave a small nod. I'll come. For now. Fair enough. Donald turned toward where he'd left Jenny. Got a mule can carry us both if you're willing. Mariah gathered her few possessions, a threadbare blanket, a small knife, some cooking things, wrapping them in a bundle she could carry. Donald noticed she moved with a natural grace despite her obvious hunger. Her features might have drawn scorn in town, but he saw only dignity in the proud set of her head, the careful way she carried herself. The sun had nearly set by the time they started up the trail. Jenny seemed unbothered by the extra weight, picking her way surely through the growing darkness. Mariah sat behind Donald, holding on but keeping as much distance as the saddle allowed. About halfway up the mountain, they stopped at a stream to rest. The water ran clear and cold, and Jenny drank deeply. Mariah slipped down from the saddle, moving with the stiffness of one unused to riding. Here. She pulled a small pouch from her bundle, offering it to Donald. Dried service berries. I gathered them last week. Donald accepted a handful of the wrinkled purple fruits, the simple gesture of sharing what little she had touched something in him he thought long buried. They sat on sun-warmed rocks, eating berries, and listening to the stream's quiet song. My uncle taught me which ones were good to eat, Mariah said suddenly, before the soldiers came. He knew all the plants and their uses. Donald nodded, noting how she spoke of her Apache family without shame. Useful knowledge, he said. Saved my life more than once, knowing what grows wild up here. The rest break passed in comfortable quiet. When they mounted up again, Mariah seemed to sit a little easier in the saddle. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside. The moon rose, painting the rocks silver and casting deep shadows in the ravines. Finally, they crested a ridge and Donald's cabin came into view. It wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, a small barn for Jenny. But lamplight gleamed welcome through the single window, and smoke still curled from the morning's fire. Donald helped Mariah down, then led Jenny to the barn. When he'd settled the mule with hay and water, he returned to find Mariah standing uncertainly by the cabin door. Come on in, he said, lifting the latch. The fire needs building up, but it's warm enough. The cabin's single room was spare but tidy. A plank table with 2 chairs stood near the hearth. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a narrow bed occupied one corner. Donald busied himself with the fire, adding small splits of pine until the flames caught and grew. You can have the bed, he said, straightening up. I'll make a pallet here by the fire. Mariah hadn't moved from the doorway. Her eyes took in every detail of the cabin, marking exits, studying shadows. Donald recognized the wariness of one who'd learned survival the hard way. He moved to the table and pulled out both chairs. From a cupboard, he took down 2 tin plates, 2 cups, a loaf of bread, and some dried venison. The simple act of setting 2 places instead of 1 made his hands tremble slightly. Ain't much, he said gruffly, but you're welcome to share it. Mariah finally stepped fully into the cabin, closing the door behind her. She approached the table slowly, her mother's cross still held tight in one hand. When Donald gestured to a chair, she sat carefully, her back straight. Before touching the food, she bowed her head. Her lips moved in silent prayer, a gesture so familiar it made Donald's chest ache. How many times had he watched Sarah do the same, teaching little Ruth to thank God for their daily bread? The sight of this half-wild girl showing such simple faith stirred something he'd thought long dead. Without meaning to, he found his own head bowing, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed. When Mariah looked up, her dark eyes met his across the rough-hewn table. Something passed between them. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. They ate in silence as the fire crackled and night settled deep around the mountain cabin. It was a fragile thing, this tentative alliance between a grieving mountain man and a lonely girl. But as Donald watched Mariah carefully wrap the remaining bread in her napkin, a habit born of too many hungry days, he felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope. The silver cross gleamed in the firelight, a testament to promises made and kept, to a mother's love reaching beyond death to guide her daughter home. Whether this cabin could become that home remained to be seen, but for tonight at least, 2 lost souls had found shelter together on the mountain. Dawn crept over the mountain in pale fingers of light. revealing a thin blanket of snow that had fallen during the night. Inside the cabin, Mariah woke before Donald, her eyes taking in the frost patterns on the single window pane. Without a word, she rose from the bed and reached for the rough-bristled broom propped in the corner. Donald stirred at the soft swooshing sound, watching through half-closed eyes as the girl methodically swept the packed dirt floor. Her movements were practiced, efficient. Clearly not her first time at such chores. When she noticed him watching, she paused. "Mama always said a clean home makes for a clear mind," she said quietly, continuing her sweeping. "Even when we had little else, we kept things tidy." Donald sat up from his pallet by the cold hearth, joints creaking. "Reckon your mama was right about that." He reached for his boots, noting how she'd already arranged the previous night's dishes neatly on the shelf. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Donald showed Mariah to the woodpile, where split logs waited to be turned into kindling. "Here now," he said, positioning a piece of pine on the chopping block. "Hold the axe just so. Let the weight do the work." He demonstrated the proper swing, the blade striking true. Mariah watched intently, then took the axe herself. Her first few attempts glanced off the wood, but she adjusted her grip, determined. Soon she had a neat pile of kindling at her feet. "You're a quick study," Donald observed. "Had to be," she replied simply, gathering the wood in her arms. "Winter's coming. Can't afford to waste time learning slow." As they carried the kindling inside, Mariah paused by a cluster of sage growing near the cabin wall. "May I?" she asked, reaching for a sprig. Donald nodded, curious. He watched as she carefully broke off several stems, explaining, "Good with rabbit meat. Makes it taste sweeter." From her bundle, she produced a small package wrapped in cloth, the rabbit she'd caught the day before. Together, they rebuilt the fire, and Mariah showed him how to arrange the coals just right. She placed the seasoned meat on a flat stone near the heat, turning it carefully as it cooked. The herbs released their sharp, clean scent into the air. "Smells good," Donald admitted, his stomach rumbling. It had been a long time since anyone had cooked in his cabin besides himself. As they ate, Donald studied the girl across the table. She seemed more at ease than the night before, though wariness still showed in the set of her shoulders. "Tell me about your mother," he said gently. "Her last days, if you don't mind speaking of it." Mariah was quiet for a long moment, one hand straying to the silver cross at her throat. "She knew she was dying," she finally said. "The fever took her quick, but she held on long enough to make sure I'd be provided for." Her voice grew softer. "She told me about the deed, how she'd hidden it in that old pine. Said someday a good man would find it, someone who'd help make things right." Donald's hand stilled on his plate. "I ain't sure I qualify as that good man your mother spoke of." "Maybe that's why you do," Mariah said simply, her dark eyes meeting his. The words hit Donald like a physical blow. He pushed back from the table, suddenly restless. "We should ride into town," he said gruffly. "Show Reverend Harlan the deed. Make sure everything's proper and legal-like." Mariah tensed slightly but nodded. "Will people there, will they treat me like before?" "Not while you're with me," Donald said firmly, surprising himself with the protective edge in his voice. They saddled Jenny after breakfast, the mule patient as ever with 2 riders. The trip down the mountain took longer in the morning frost, but by mid-morning, they reached the outskirts of town. Donald felt Mariah's spine stiffen as they passed the first buildings. The church stood at the far end of the main street, its white-painted boards bright in the winter sun. Reverend Harlan was in his small study behind the sanctuary, bent over his ledgers when they knocked. "Well now," the preacher said, looking up with surprise. His kind eyes took in Mariah's nervous stance, Donald's protective hover. Come in. The Lord's house welcomes all." Donald produced the deed and letters explaining how he'd found them. The Reverend examined the papers carefully, nodding as he read. "Everything appears in order," he said finally. "The land grant is legitimate, properly recorded with the territory office." He smiled at Mariah. "Your mother was a wise woman, child. She made sure your inheritance would be protected." Mariah's shoulders relaxed slightly at his gentle tone. The Reverend stood, placing one weathered hand on her head. "May the Lord bless you and keep you," he said softly. "You are indeed your mother's daughter, and a child of God." Tears sparkled in Mariah's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. Donald felt something catch in his own throat at the simple blessing. Their moment of peace was broken by sharp footsteps on the church's wooden floor. Samuel Lyle, the town banker, appeared in the study doorway, his normally smooth face creased with interest. "I couldn't help but notice you carrying papers, Braddock," he said, eyes fixed on the documents on the Reverend's desk. "Something that needs the bank's attention, perhaps." "Private business," Donald said shortly, gathering up the deed and letters. The banker's lips thinned. Now. As the primary holder of property notes in this region, I have a responsibility to verify all land claims, particularly when they involve," his gaze slid dismissively over Mariah, "unusual circumstances." "The deed is legitimate," Reverend Harlan said firmly. "I've verified it myself." "Even so," Lyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. "These matters require proper scrutiny. The territory office will need to be consulted. Courts may need to be involved. These things take time, you understand?" Donald's hand tightened on the papers. "Meaning you aim to make trouble?" "Meaning I aim to ensure everything is properly legal," Lyle corrected smoothly. "We wouldn't want anyone making invalid claims, would we?" The threat in his words was clear. Donald stepped slightly in front of Mariah, shielding her from the banker's cold stare. "Much obliged for your concern," he said stiffly. "We'll be going now." They left the church quickly, but Donald could feel eyes following them down the street. Word traveled fast in small towns. Already he noticed people gathering in doorways, whispering behind their hands. By the time they reached the saloon at the end of the street, the afternoon crowds were beginning to gather. "Hold tight," Donald murmured to Mariah as they passed. "Don't look their way." But he could hear the murmurs, see the hostile glances. The discovery of the deed had stirred up something ugly, like a stick poking a nest of snakes. His years of mountain solitude had made him forget how quickly townfolk could turn, how greed could poison minds against what was right. Jenny's hooves struck the frozen ground in a steady rhythm as they climbed back toward the cabin. Donald felt Mariah's arms tighten around his waist as they left town behind, but neither spoke until the buildings disappeared from view. "They'll try to take it, won't they?" Mariah asked quietly. "The land, just like they took everything else." Donald thought of Lyle's cold eyes, the whispers in the street. "They might try," he admitted, "but your mother made sure you had proof of your claim. And you've got folk on your side now." "You mean you?" There was a hint of wonder in her voice. "Reckon so," Donald said gruffly, "and the Reverend too. Man of God's worth having in your corner." They rode on in silence as the shadows lengthened across the snow. Donald's mind worked over the day's events, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd wanted no part of other people's troubles, and fled to the mountains to escape exactly this kind of conflict. But watching Mariah's straight back as she faced down the town's prejudice, remembering her mother's faith that a good man would help, he knew he couldn't walk away. Sometimes a man's conscience gave him no choice but to stand his ground. The cabin came into view just as the sun touched the western peaks. Smoke still curled from the chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire, promising warmth against the gathering cold. Donald helped Mariah down from Jenny's back, noting how she seemed to stand a little taller despite the day's tensions. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain cabin. Donald had risen early, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. Mariah helped him with the morning chores, her movements becoming more familiar with each passing day. The routine felt almost peaceful, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. Donald moved to the window, his body tensing as he counted 3 riders approaching through the trees. He recognized the man in front, Clay Maddox, one of the biggest ranchers in the valley. The other 2 were strangers, hard-looking men with well-worn gun belts. "Get inside," Donald said quietly to Mariah, who was feeding scraps to the chickens. She looked up, saw his expression, and quickly slipped through the cabin door. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their horses stamping in the frosted dirt. Maddox sat easily in his saddle, a man used to having his way. His expensive coat and polished boots spoke of wealth, but there was something cold in his eyes that made Donald's hand drift toward his rifle. "Braddock," Maddox called out, not bothering to dismount. "Heard tell you're claiming some riverside property." Donald stepped onto the porch, positioning himself in front of the door. "Not claiming. Got legal deed to it." Maddox's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's where we have a problem." That land's been promised to my operation. Going to need those grazing rights for my spring drive? Promised by who? Donald asked quietly. Paper I've got says different. One of Maddox's men shifted in his saddle, hand resting too casually near his holster. Donald's fingers wrapped around his rifle barrel, though he kept it pointed down. Let's be reasonable, Maddox said, his voice smooth as creek ice. Whatever that half-breed girl told you? Watch your mouth, Donald cut in, voice hard as iron. Maddox's eyes narrowed. That land's worth good money to the right buyer, more than you'd see in 10 years of trapping. I'm prepared to be generous, if you hand over that deed now. Not for sale. Donald lifted the rifle slightly. And it ain't mine to sell. Belongs to the girl. The girl, Maddox spat. Ain't no court going to uphold her claim, and you know it. You're fixing to get yourself in a world of trouble, mountain man. Sheriff will be up here next, and he knows which side his bread's buttered on. Donald said nothing, just stood his ground. After a long moment, Maddox gathered his reins. Think on it, Braddock. Things can get mighty uncomfortable for a man up here alone. He wheeled his horse, the other riders following. At the edge of the clearing, he called back, Sheriff Crane will be paying you a visit. Best have that deed ready. Donald watched until they disappeared into the trees, only then did he hear the cabin door creak open behind him. Are they gone? Mariah's voice was barely above a whisper. For now. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself. The silver cross gleamed at her throat. Can you? She swallowed hard. Can you really protect me? From men like that? Donald looked down at the young girl, seeing both fear and trust in her eyes. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. Won't let them harm you, he said gruffly, or take what's rightfully yours. Your mama trusted that deed would keep you safe. And so it will. Mariah nodded, though her hand still trembled slightly. Donald guided her back inside, where the coffee pot was beginning to bubble over. They went through the motions of breakfast, but both kept glancing toward the window, watching for more riders, and they didn't have long to wait. Just past noon, they heard another horse approaching, single rider this time. Donald recognized Sheriff Abel Crane's bay gelding before the man himself came into view. Stay inside, he told Mariah, who had already shrunk back from the window. Let me handle this. The sheriff dismounted stiffly, hitching his horse to the porch rail. His badge glinted in the winter sun, but his expression was troubled as he approached. Donald, he nodded. Heard you had some visitors this morning. News travels fast, Donald said dryly. Crane shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know you're trying to do right by the girl, but Maddox has influence with the territorial office. Could make things difficult. That what brings you up here doing Maddox's bidding? The sheriff's face reddened. I'm here in my official capacity. Need to examine that deed, make sure everything's proper and legal. Reverend Harlan already verified it yesterday. All due respect to the Reverend, but he ain't a legal authority. Crane straightened his gun belt. I'll need to take that deed back to town. For review. Donald's voice hardened. You mean so Maddox's lawyers can lose it or find some way to void it? Now see here, Crane began, but Donald cut him off. You know what's right here, Abel. That land belongs to the girl, fair and square. Her mother made sure of it. You going to let Maddox steal it just because he's got money and influence? The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. Just doing my job, Donald. Hand over the deed, nice and peaceful like. No. Donald's voice was quiet but firm. You want that deed, you'll need to take it. And I don't reckon you want to try that. Tension crackled between them. Crane's hand twitched near his gun, but they both knew he wouldn't draw. Finally, the sheriff backed down. You're making a mistake, Donald. Maddox won't let this go. Neither will I. They stood facing each other a moment longer, then Crane turned and mounted up. This ain't over, he called as he rode away. Donald watched until he disappeared, then went back inside. Mariah stood by the fireplace, her face pale, but determined. What happens now, she asked. Donald sighed heavily. We wait. And we pray. Mariah's eyes widened slightly at his words. Without comment, she knelt by the rough wooden chair they used for prayers. After a moment's hesitation, Donald knelt beside her. Dear Lord, Mariah began softly, please watch over us and guard our steps. Protect us from those who would do us harm. Give us strength to stand for what's right." Donald listened to her simple, heartfelt words. When she finished, he found himself whispering his own prayer, the first in more years than he could count. "Lord," he said roughly, "help me keep her safe. Help me be the good man her mother believed would come." The cabin grew quiet as darkness settled outside. Donald built up the fire while Mariah prepared their simple supper. Neither spoke much, but there was comfort in the shared silence. What they didn't see was the figure standing just within the tree line, watching the lamplight glow through the cabin's single window. The man stood motionless in the gathering dark, then melted away into the forest as silently as he had come. Inside, Donald checked his rifle one last time before settling into his chair by the fire. The deed lay secure in his coat pocket, close at hand. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but for tonight, they were safe. He watched Mariah curled in her blankets by the hearth, the silver cross still gleaming at her throat, and knew he had chosen his path. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back. The morning sun painted the eastern sky in bands of pink and gold as Donald saddled his old mare. Mariah watched from the cabin door, a small bundle of dried food tucked into her shawl. "Time you learned the high trails," Donald said, adjusting the cinch. "Might need them someday." Mariah nodded solemnly, understanding his meaning. With practiced ease born from years in the mountains, Donald helped her mount behind him. The mare snorted, her breath making clouds in the crisp dawn air. They rode upward through stands of pine and aspen, following game trails that switchbacked up the mountainside. Donald pointed out landmarks as they went. A lightning-struck tree, a distinctive boulder, a spring trickling from moss-covered rocks. "Remember these," he said. "They'll guide you if you're ever up here alone." "Like the stars guided my father's people," Mariah said quietly. It was the first time she'd mentioned her Apache heritage so directly. Donald glanced back at her. "Your mama wrote about him in those letters. Said he was a good man." "He was," Mariah's voice held pride mixed with old pain. "He taught me many things before the soldiers came." They emerged into a high meadow carpeted with early spring flowers. Donald reined in, letting Mariah slide down to explore. She moved with quiet grace through the grass, occasionally stooping to gather plants into her bundle. "This one," she said, holding up a spray of purple flowers, "my father's sister used for fever. She would dry the blooms and make tea." She pointed to another plant with tiny white flowers. "And these leaves, crushed and mixed with fat, draw poison from snake bites." Donald watched her work, impressed by her sure knowledge. "Your aunt taught you well." "She did." Mariah carefully wrapped her gathered herbs in a cloth. Before she trailed off, but Donald understood. So much loss in such a young life. The sun climbed higher as they explored the meadow. Donald showed her where deer came to drink and which slopes offered the quickest escape routes. Mariah absorbed it all, her quick mind mapping the terrain. When they finally turned back toward the cabin, Donald felt more at ease. The girl was capable, resourceful. She'd survive up here if need be. They spotted the horse tied outside their cabin before they reached the clearing. Donald's hand went to his rifle, but then he recognized Reverend Harlan's old paint mare. The preacher rose from the porch steps as they approached. "Beautiful morning for a ride," he said, smiling at Mariah. "I brought news that couldn't wait." Inside the cabin, over cups of coffee, mint tea for Mariah, Reverend Harlan explained his plan. "Circuit preachers due through in 2 weeks' time," he said. "Reverend Matthews, good man, knows territorial law as well as scripture. He can verify that deed proper and legal, give it his seal." He leaned forward earnestly. "That'll carry weight with the territorial office, make it harder for Maddox to challenge." Hope flickered in Mariah's dark eyes. "He'll help us, He's known for standing up for Indian rights," Harlan nodded. "Won't let your Apache blood be used against you, child." Donald set his cup down carefully. 2 weeks is a long time, Reverend. Maddox ain't one to wait patient." "No." Harlan's face grew grave. "That's why I came early. There's trouble brewing in town." He told them how Maddox had spent the morning in the saloon buying drinks and spreading poison, calling Mariah an illegitimate squatter, claiming Donald was using her to steal valuable water rights. "The bankers involved too," Harlan added. "Posted a notice this morning questioning the deed's validity. Technical grounds, saying proper surveys weren't done, boundaries aren't clear." That deed's got proper marks, Donald growled. You saw them yourself. I did. But Banker Lyle's got influence. People listen when he talks about legal matters. The preacher sighed. Already heard folk muttering against you both. Saying it ain't right. A single man harboring a young girl. Saying worse things about Mariah's background. Donald's hands clenched. Mariah sat very still. Her face composed, but her eyes showing old hurt. The Lord sees their hearts, Reverend Harlan said gently. Just hold fast till Matthews arrives. Keep the deed safe. He stood, settling his hat. I'll ride out again when I can. Been praying for you both. After the preacher left, Donald and Mariah worked together preparing supper. She showed him how to add some of her gathered herbs to the venison stew, explaining which ones brought out the meat's flavor. The simple domestic task seemed to ease the tension. By the time they sat down to eat, the cabin felt almost homelike. Mariah told a story about her mother teaching her to make fry bread, imitating how the dough had stuck to her small fingers. Donald found himself chuckling, the sound rusty from disuse. Mariah's eyes widened at his laugh, then crinkled with her own smile. For a precious moment, they were just a man and a girl sharing a meal, not fugitives guarding a disputed deed. But reality returned as darkness fell. Donald insisted Mariah take the bed in the corner while he kept watch. She protested at first, but eventually curled up under the quilts, the silver cross gleaming at her throat. Sleep peaceful, Donald said gruffly. Ain't nothing going to harm you here? Her breathing soon steadied into the rhythm of slumber. Donald loaded his rifle with careful hands, then settled into the chair by the window. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. The moon cast sharp shadows through the pines. He touched the deed in his pocket, thinking of the trust placed in him. By Mariah's mother, by the girl herself. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavy on his shoulders as he kept his vigil through the long night hours. In town, he knew, men would be drinking in the saloon, their talk growing darker with each glass. Maddox would be there, feeding their prejudices, turning them against the mountain man and the half-Apache girl who dared claim valuable water rights. But here in the cabin, Mariah slept safe under his protection. Whatever came, Donald would keep his promise. The Lord and the law might yet prove stronger than greed and hatred. He settled deeper into his chair, rifle across his knees, and watched the moon track across the sky. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing what it would. For now, his duty was clear. Guard the girl, guard the deed, and pray Reverend Matthews arrived before Maddox made his move. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Mariah folded her mother's letters carefully. I want to go to town with you today, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Donald looked up from oiling his rifle. Ain't safe there, girl. You heard what the Reverend said. I heard. Mariah's chin lifted. But I won't hide like I'm ashamed. My mother never did. Donald studied her face, seeing determination in those dark eyes, the same pride he'd noticed when they first met by the river. After a long moment, he nodded. All right. But you stay close. They rode double on Donald's horse, reaching town as the morning bustle was building. Dust rose from the main street as wagons rolled past. Women in long skirts hurried between the shops, while cowboys lounged outside the saloon, despite the early hour. Donald helped Mariah down in front of the general store. Eyes turned their way immediately. Some folks crossed the street to avoid them. Others stared openly, whispering behind raised hands. The store bell jingled as they entered. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, stood arranging dry goods on a shelf. She turned, then froze at the sight of Mariah. Good morning, Mariah said softly, ducking her head in a polite gesture. Mrs. Peterson's face softened as she took in the girl's thin frame and patched dress. Good morning, child. She glanced at Donald. What can I help you with today? Just some supplies, Donald said gruffly. Coffee, flour, such like. While Donald gathered their items, 3 church ladies entered, their conversation falling silent when they spotted Mariah. The girl stood straight under their scrutiny, though Donald saw her fingers twist nervously in her skirt. Mrs. Taylor, the minister's wife, stepped closer. You're the one staying up at Mr. Braddock's cabin? Yes, ma'am. Mariah's voice was steady. He's protecting me until the circuit preacher comes. The women exchanged glances. Mrs. Taylor's eyes lingered on Mariah's worn clothes and the proud way she carried herself despite them. Child, when did you eat last? Mrs. Taylor asked gently. "This morning, ma'am. Mr. Braddock makes sure I have enough." Mrs. Taylor nodded, then turned to the counter. "Sarah, wrap up some of that fresh bread. And that blue wool shawl on the shelf there." "Oh no, ma'am, please," Mariah started to protest. "Hush now." Mrs. Taylor's tone was kind but firm. "Winter's not done with us yet. A growing girl needs warmth." The other churchwomen added small items to the pile: a ribbon for Mariah's hair, a packet of hard candies. Their earlier wariness melted as they saw not a threat, but a child in need of mothering. Donald watched silently, his throat tight. He'd forgotten how good women could be to each other, how quickly they could move from suspicion to care. The bell jingled again. 3 ranch hands swaggered in, stopping short at the sight of Mariah surrounded by the churchwomen. One of them spat on the floor. "Since when we letting squaws shop with decent folk?" he drawled. Mrs. Taylor drew herself up. "Mind your language, Jake Wilson. This is a respectable establishment." "Ain't nothing respectable about mixing with savages," another hand said. He stepped closer to Mariah, deliberately bumping against her. "Even half-breeds." Donald's hand dropped to his gun belt. The ranch hand saw the movement and sneered. "What's wrong, mountain man? Truth hurt?" "The truth," Donald said quietly, "is that you're fixing to lose teeth if you touch her again." Tension crackled. Mrs. Peterson hurried behind her counter. The churchwomen drew back, clutching their parcels. Now, Mrs. Taylor said quickly, "it's nearly time for service. Reverend Harlan won't take kindly to fighting on the Lord's Day." Donald forced his fingers to unclench. "Come on, Mariah. We'll head to church early." The ranch hands parted with exaggerated mockery, bowing and sweeping their hats. "After you, princess," Jake Wilson sneered. Mariah walked past them with her head high, though Donald saw her hands trembling. He gathered their purchases, including the gifts from the churchwomen, and followed her out. The church bell was already ringing as they approached the white-painted building. Reverend Harlan stood at the door, greeting his flock. His eyes widened slightly at seeing Mariah, but he smiled warmly. "Welcome, child. I'm glad you've come to worship with us." And then inside they took a pew near the back. The churchwomen who'd shown kindness at the store seated themselves nearby, creating a buffer between Mariah and less friendly faces. As the congregation settled, Reverend Harlan approached their pew. "Mariah," he said softly, "I understand you know some hymns?" She nodded. "My mother taught me." "Would you share one with us today?" Mariah's eyes widened. Donald started to object, but she touched his arm. "I will, Reverend." When the time came, she walked to the front with steady steps. A murmur ran through the church as she turned to face them. Then she began to sing. Her voice rose clear and sweet, filling the small space with amazing grace. She sang it simply, but with deep feeling, as if each word held personal meaning. Donald saw several women dabbing at their eyes. Even some of the men who'd been scowling softened as Mariah's voice carried the familiar verses. But not all. In the back pew, Clay Maddox and his men sat like dark clouds, their faces hard with anger. After the service, people filed out slowly. Several stopped to compliment Mariah's singing, including Mrs. Taylor and her friends. But others hurried past, avoiding eye contact. Reverend Harlan drew Donald aside while Mariah chatted with the churchwomen. "You're walking a narrow path, friend," he said quietly. "Maddox is gathering support. Best keep that deed well hidden until Matthews arrives." Donald nodded. "How long?" 10 more days." The preacher squeezed his shoulder. "Hold fast. God sees your kindness to this child." They rode home as the sun settled toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Mariah wore her new blue shawl, running the soft wool between her fingers. "Some of them were kind," she said thoughtfully. Aye, some were. Donald didn't mention the others, the ones whose hatred had burned in their eyes. Back at the cabin, Donald built up the fire while Mariah arranged her small gifts on a shelf. The ribbon, the candies, the fresh bread they'd share for supper. Such simple things, yet her face glowed as she touched each one. After their meal, Donald waited until Mariah was occupied with mending before he pried up a loose floorboard beneath his bed. The iron box fit perfectly in the space. He placed the deed inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp, then carefully replaced the board. Wind rattled the window panes, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Donald added wood to the fire, watching Mariah sew by its light. She hummed Amazing Grace softly, the tune that had moved hearts that morning. But not all hearts could be moved by a child's song. Donald remembered Maddox's cold eyes in church, the barely contained violence in his men's stance. The storm building outside matched the one he felt coming. He checked his rifle one more time before settling into his watch chair. The deed lay safe beneath the floor, but paper alone wouldn't protect Mariah's inheritance. That would take stronger measures, and Donald feared they'd learn soon enough what those measures must be. The storm arrived with the dawn, heavy curtains of snow sweeping down from leaden skies. Donald woke to find his cabin windows frosted over, the world beyond transformed into white silence. He added wood to the banked coals, coaxing the fire back to life as Mariah stirred on her pallet near the hearth. "Looks like we're staying put today," he said, watching the snow pile against the door. "Storm's got us proper trapped." Mariah nodded, wrapping her new blue shawl tighter around her shoulders as she moved to help with breakfast. They worked together in the dim light, making coffee and heating yesterday's biscuits. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. As morning wore into afternoon, they found ways to pass the confined hours. Mariah showed Donald how to repair his worn moccasins using sinew thread, her small fingers demonstrating the tight stitches. The familiar work seemed to ease something in her. "My uncle taught me this," she said softly, working the awl through tough hide. "He said Apache children must learn to make what they need." Donald watched her sure movements. "Your uncle sounds like a wise man?" He was. Mariah's eyes grew distant. "Before the soldiers came." They worked in silence for a while, the fire crackling and snow hissing against the windows. As Mariah finished the last stitches, she glanced at Donald. "Would you like to learn some Apache words?" she asked hesitantly. Donald paused in his whittling. "Reckon I would." A small smile touched her lips. She pointed to herself. "Shiyaji means my child." Then she touched his arm. "Shije means my father." Donald's throat tightened at the word. He repeated it carefully. "Shije." "Yes." Mariah's voice grew softer. "And this one is important. Ndaz. It means protector." "Ndaz," Donald echoed, the strange syllables feeling right somehow. Outside, the storm raged on, but in the cabin's warmth, something shifted between them. A trust deepening like roots seeking soil. As evening approached, Donald stirred the stew simmering over the fire. "Reckon it's time I told you about them I lost?" he said quietly. Mariah set aside her mending, watching him with gentle eyes. "Sarah was my wife's name." Donald's voice roughened. "She had yellow hair like summer wheat. Our boy, William, took after her that way. He was just turned 5 when the fever came." The fire popped and sparked as Donald continued. "I was up checking trap lines by the time I got back." He stopped, the old grief rising fresh. "Buried them side by side under the cottonwoods. Couldn't bear to stay there after. That's when I came up here to the high country." Mariah's small hand found his, squeezing gently. They sat together in the firelight, two souls who knew loss, finding comfort in shared understanding. The storm held them captive through the next day as well. They passed the hours with quiet tasks, Donald showing Mariah how to clean his rifle properly, Mariah teaching him more Apache words. She sang sometimes, soft hymns that merged with the wind's moan. On the third morning, Donald woke to silence. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving the world hushed under fresh snow. After breakfast, he pulled on his heavy coat. "Need to cut more wood," he said. "Storm near emptied our stack." The air bit sharp and clean as Donald trudged through knee-deep drifts to the woodpile. He was splitting his third log when something caught his eye, a depression in the snow near the cabin's corner. Moving closer, he found hoofprints, partially filled by the storm's last flurries. His spine prickled as he followed the tracks. They circled the entire cabin, coming close to each window. Someone had been watching them during the storm, using the weather's cover to scout their refuge. Donald gathered the split wood quickly, scanning the tree line as he worked. Nothing moved in the pristine white landscape, but the tracks told their own story. They were being hunted. That evening, he and Mariah ate their simple supper in tense silence. She seemed to sense his unease, her own movements, careful and quiet. Donald had just finished cleaning their plates when a sharp knock made them both jump. He grabbed his rifle before cracking the door. Outside stood Jim Wheeler, an old trapper Donald knew from his fur trading days. "Evening, Braddock," Wheeler said, stamping snow from his boots. "Mind if I warm up a spell?" Donald let him in, noting the man's troubled expression. Wheeler nodded to Mariah before settling by the fire. "Came to warn you," he said without preamble. "Was in town yesterday. Maddox has been busy." Donald's hands tightened on his rifle. "How so?" "Got the sheriff in his pocket now. They're fixing to issue a warrant, claiming the girl there's a thief. Say she stole things from the general store." "That's a lie." Mariah's voice cracked. "Mrs. Taylor gave me those things. They were gifts." Wheeler nodded sadly. "Truth ain't what matters to Maddox. He's done waiting on courts and preachers. Means to break you soon, Braddock." Donald's jaw clenched. "Much obliged for the warning, Jim." After Wheeler left, Donald double-checked the door's heavy bar. Mariah stood by the fire, her face pale in the flickering light. "What will we do?" she whispered. Donald looked at her, this brave, wounded child who'd awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. "We'll hold fast," he said firmly. "Got 10 days till the circuit preacher comes. We just need to last that long." But as he took up his watch by the window, rifle across his knees, Donald knew Maddox wouldn't wait 10 days. The hoofprints in the snow, the false warrant, these were opening moves in a game that would end in violence. The fire burned low as night deepened. Mariah eventually curled up on her pallet, but Donald saw she only pretended sleep. Her fingers kept touching the silver cross at her throat, lips moving in silent prayer. Outside, an owl called once, its cry echoing across the snow-hushed valley. Donald settled deeper into his chair, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. The storm had passed, but a different kind of tempest was gathering. One that would test everything he'd become since finding that rusted box in a fallen pine. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in golden light as Donald stepped onto his cabin's porch, coffee cup steaming in the crisp morning air. The snow from the storm had mostly melted, leaving muddy patches between lingering drifts. His eyes swept the tree line, searching for movement, a habit born of recent tension. A flicker of orange caught his attention. Smoke curled from the barn's roof, not the usual thin wisp from morning dew, but thick and dark. His heart lurched. Fire! Donald dropped his cup, bolting toward the barn. Mariah! The barn's burning. Mariah burst from the cabin, her shawl flying. Together they raced across the muddy yard. Flames were already consuming the barn's rear wall, spreading fast across the dry timber. Inside, Donald's mule kicked and brayed in panic. "Get the water barrel," Donald shouted, wrestling with the barn door's heavy latch. Heat scorched his face as he yanked it open. Smoke billowed out, choking him. The mule's eyes rolled white with terror. Donald grabbed its lead rope, speaking low and steady despite his racing heart. "Easy now, easy." He led the frightened animal out while Mariah struggled to roll the heavy water barrel closer. "The supplies," and Mariah coughed, pointing into the burning barn. Their winter stores lay stacked along the walls. Dried meat, grain, medicines she'd gathered. Donald dove back in, grabbing what he could. His lungs burned. Sweat streamed down his face as he passed armloads to Mariah. They worked frantically, throwing buckets of water at the flames, but the fire had too much hold. The barn's timbers groaned. Donald grabbed Mariah's arm, pulling her back as the roof began to sag. "That's enough," he said grimly. "It's lost." They stood helpless, watching the barn collapse in a shower of sparks. The mule huddled behind them, sides heaving. Through the smoke and floating ash, Donald heard hoofbeats approaching. Clay Maddox rode into view, flanked by 2 of his men. Their horses' hooves kicked up mud as they reined to a stop. Maddox's face wore a mask of false concern. My, he drawled, looking at the burning ruins. "Terrible accident makes a man wonder if this remote place is really safe for raising a child." Donald's hands clenched into fists. "This was no accident, Maddox. Your men set that fire." "Serious accusation, Braddock." Maddox's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Got any proof?" "Don't need proof to know a snake when I see one." Now. Maddox shifted in his saddle, gesturing at the smoking wreckage. "I'm just concerned for the girl's welfare. Living way up here, isolated, with a man who's not her kin. Accidents can happen. Might be safer if proper authorities looked into things." Mariah pressed against Donald's side. He felt her trembling, though her voice rang strong. "He's more my family than you'll ever be." "Ain't that sweet?" Maddox's smile turned ugly. "We'll see what the law has to say about that." He wheeled his horse around. Come on, boys. Our civic duty's done here. Donald took a step forward, rage boiling in his chest. You set foot on my land again, Maddox. You'll leave feet first. Maddox just laughed, spurring his horse. His men followed, leaving Donald and Mariah alone with their smoldering barn. They salvaged what they could from the ruins, some tools, half their winter supplies, badly smoked but still usable. The mule would need shelter in the cabin's lean-to until they could rebuild. Donald's jaw ached from clenching his teeth as they worked. By afternoon, exhaustion dragged at them both. I need to gather more firewood, Mariah said, wiping soot from her face. The storm used so much, and now with the barn wood gone. Donald nodded absently, still calculating their losses. Stay close to the river where I can see you. Don't go past the big boulder. I know. She touched his arm. We'll be all right? God's watching over us. Donald managed a tight smile, though his faith felt as scorched as the barn's timbers. He watched her walk toward the river, basket in hand, her blue shawl bright against the patches of snow. He turned back to sorting through the damaged supplies, trying to ignore the knot of worry in his gut. The sound of splitting wood rang out as Mariah broke fallen branches. Normal. Safe. Then, silence. Donald's head snapped up. Mariah? No answer. He ran toward the river, heart thundering. Her basket lay overturned, spilling kindling. The snow held fresh hoofprints. Multiple horses, leading toward town. No, he breathed. No. He ran back to the cabin, grabbed his rifle and saddle. The mule wasn't built for speed, but it would have to do. He swung up, fighting the animal's tired reluctance, and pointed it down the mountain trail. The hoofprints were easy to follow in the wet spring earth. They led straight to town, just as he'd feared. Donald's hands shook on the reins as he urged the mule faster. Mariah's face haunted him. Her trust in his protection? Now, broken. The sheriff's office squatted at the end of the muddy main street. Donald dismounted, rifle ready, and burst through the door. Sheriff Crane looked up from his desk, unsurprised. Where is she? Donald demanded. Crane jerked his thumb toward the cells. Had to lock her up. Got complaints about theft from the general store. Donald strode to the cells. Mariah sat on a narrow cot, her shawl dirty and torn. She clutched her mother's silver cross, lips moving in silent prayer. When she saw Donald, her eyes filled with tears. This is garbage and you know it, Donald rounded on the sheriff. Those were gifts from the churchwomen. Mrs. Taylor herself gave her that shawl. Maybe so, Crane wouldn't meet his eyes. But there's been a formal complaint. Gotta hold her till we sort it out proper. Hearing set for next week. Next week? Donald's voice cracked. You can't keep her here that long. She's just a child. Law's the law. Crane's hands spread in a helpless gesture that fooled no one. Unless someone wants to post bail, $100 ought to do it. Donald's stomach clenched. They both knew he didn't have that kind of money, not after winter's expenses and now the barn. He gripped the cell bars until his knuckles went white. It's all right, Mariah whispered. I trust God will see us through. This isn't God's doing, Donald growled. This is Maddox pulling strings like the devil himself. He glared at Crane. How much did he pay you? The sheriff flushed. Get out, Braddock. Before I decide you need a cell, too. Donald pressed his forehead against the cold bars. I'll get you out of here, Mariah. I swear it. I know. She managed a brave smile. I'll be all right. Just don't do anything foolish. The walk back to his mule felt endless. Donald's mind churned with useless plans. Breaking her out by force, trying to raise bail money, appealing to the territorial judge. But Maddox had laid his trap too well. Violence would only prove Donald unfit to care for Mariah. They didn't have time to wait for higher courts. The ride home was even longer. Each step of his tired mule took him further from Mariah, alone in that cell. Night had fallen by the time he reached the cabin. The barn's ruins still smoldered, sending up ghostly wisps of smoke. Donald slumped in his chair before the hearth, staring at the glowing embers. His rifle lay across his knees. Cold comfort now. What good was a gun against the web of lies and legal tricks Maddox had woven? The truth hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't fight this with bullets. Maddox was counting on that, wanting him to react with violence. No, this battle would have to be won differently. He needed the town itself on his side. The church women who'd shown kindness to Mariah, the farmers who resented Maddox's greed, even the sheriff's own conscience. Donald's hands unclenched slowly. He thought of Mariah's quiet faith, her trust that God would make a way. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps there was a power stronger than guns or money, the power of truth itself and the goodness in people's hearts when they chose to listen. The cabin felt achingly empty without Mariah's presence, but as Donald banked the fire for the night, he felt something harder than hope taking root in his soul, a determination that went beyond rage or revenge. Tomorrow, he would begin a different kind of fight, one that even Maddox wouldn't see coming. Dawn painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold as Donald mounted his tired mule. The animal shifted uneasily, sensing the long journey ahead. Donald patted its neck, checking the saddlebags one last time. He packed light, some dried meat, a blanket, his canteen. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and winter's lingering chill. "Hold on, Mariah," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him through the miles and iron bars between them. "I'm fetching help." The trail wound higher into the mountains, following ancient paths Donald had heard trappers speak of but never traveled himself. Patches of snow lingered in the shadowed hollows, though spring had softened the drifts. His mule picked its way carefully over icy streams and around jutting rocks. By midday, the sun beat down harsh and bright, reflecting off the snow until Donald's eyes ached. He stopped at a creek to rest the mule and drink from his canteen. The water tasted of minerals and mountain stone. Sitting on a fallen log, he pulled out the piece of paper where Mariah had carefully written directions to her uncle's camp. Her neat letters brought a lump to his throat. "Should have come sooner," he muttered. "Should have known we'd need allies." The afternoon stretched long as they climbed higher. The air grew thin, making both man and mule breathe harder. Donald watched the sun's arc, knowing he needed to find the camp before full dark. These heights belonged to mountain lions and wolves, not the place for sleeping rough. At last, as purple twilight crept across the sky, Donald spotted smoke rising through the trees. His muscles tensed, but he forced himself to approach slowly, respectfully. This wasn't his territory. The camp appeared gradually, a circle of hide lodges carefully placed among the trees. Children stopped their play to stare at him. Women paused in their work, some ducking inside lodges, others standing straight-backed and watchful. A few men rose from their fires, hands near weapons. Donald dismounted, keeping his movements deliberate. He'd left his rifle in its saddle scabbard, a risk, but a necessary one. Trust had to begin somewhere. An older man emerged from the largest lodge. Even in the failing light, Donald recognized him from Mariah's description. Neshoba carried himself with quiet dignity, though old scars marked his face and his left arm hung slightly stiff. His dark eyes held wisdom and wariness in equal measure. "You come far," Neshoba said in careful English. "Why?" Donald swallowed hard. "I'm Donald Braddock. I've been caring for your niece, Mariah." Neshoba's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Been caring? What has changed?" "I failed her." The words tasted bitter as gall. "Men who want her land. They burned my barn, then took her. She's locked in the town jail on false charges." A murmur ran through the watching people. Neshoba raised his hand for silence. "Come," he said simply. "We will talk." Donald followed him to a fire burning low and red. The flames cast dancing shadows on the lodge walls. An older woman brought him a cup of strong tea, then melted away into the darkness. Donald wrapped his cold fingers around the warm cup, grateful for its heat. "Tell all," Neshoba commanded, settling across the fire. So Donald did. He spoke of finding the iron box, meeting Mariah, their growing trust. He described Maddox's threats, the false warrant, Mariah's kidnapping. His voice grew rough with shame as he admitted his helplessness against the rancher's legal manipulations. "I wanted to fight," he finished, "but violence would only prove them right, prove I'm unfit to protect her." Neshoba was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. Finally, he spoke. "You think because you did not shoot? You failed? I let them take her." "Ah." Neshoba nodded slowly. "You believe strength lives only in the gun?" Donald blinked, taken aback. "What other strength is there against men like Maddox?" "Truth has strength. Mercy has strength. Neshoba touched his scarred face. I learned this hard way. Many years I fought settlers with hatred. For every wrong, I answered with wrong. It solved nothing, changed nothing. He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling upward. The path of peace is harder than path of war. Each day we must choose again to walk it, even when others choose differently. But how can peace help Mariah now? Donald demanded. She's sitting in a jail cell while Maddox plots to steal her land. You think peace means doing nothing? Neshoba's voice sharpened. No. Peace takes more courage than war. To face enemies without weapons, to speak truth when lies are easier. This is warrior's path too. Donald stared into his tea, letting the words sink in. He thought of Mariah's quiet strength, her prayers even in the jail cell. Perhaps she understood what her uncle was saying better than Donald did. Tell me about promises, he said quietly. Neshoba's eyes grew distant. So many promises made by white leaders. This land will be yours forever. These treaties will be honored. Your children will be safe. His hand clenched. All broken, like dry twigs. Yet each time we chose peace again. Why? Because hatred poisoned only our own hearts. The fire popped and crackled. Somewhere in the darkness a child laughed. The sound made Donald's chest ache. The circuit preacher comes in 3 days, he said. He could verify Mariah's deed, make it legal in white man's law. But Maddox won't wait that long. He'll find some way to break her first. Then we must show town her strength. And yours. Neshoba leaned forward. You fought for her with gun ready. Now fight for her with open hands. Let people see truth. Donald thought of the churchwomen who'd given Mariah the shawl, the farmers who resented Maddox's growing power, even the sheriff's reluctance to meet his eyes. Maybe Neshoba was right. Maybe there were more allies than he'd realized, if he knew how to reach them. I'll ride with you tomorrow, Neshoba said. My presence will remind town of promises made and broken. He smiled slightly. Perhaps help them choose better this time. Donald nodded, humbled by the offer. This man had every reason to hate him to refuse help. Instead, he chose a harder path. They slept briefly, rising before dawn. The morning air burned cold in Donald's lungs as they mounted, he on his mule, Neshoba on a sturdy pony. The camp stirred behind them, women already at their morning tasks. The descent was faster than the climb had been. Still, the sun stood high when they rounded the last bend toward Donald's cabin. Black smoke stained the blue sky. Donald's heart clenched. He kicked his mule forward, though he already knew what they'd find. The cabin was a smoking ruin. Timbers collapsed into ash. Everything he owned, everything he and Mariah had built together, gone. His hands knotted into fists. The rage he'd carried since her kidnapping roared up, demanding violence. But Neshoba's quiet presence beside him helped him master it. This was Maddox's last warning, meant to provoke exactly that reaction. He burns your past, Neshoba said softly, to keep you from building future. Donald forced his fingers to unclench. Then he's failed. Because I'm not finished building yet. They turned their mounts toward town. Donald's jaw ached from grinding his teeth, but his mind was clear. Maddox thought he'd broken them. Instead, he'd only proved how desperate he was, how afraid of the truth coming out. Well, truth was exactly what he was about to get, not delivered with bullets, but with testimony that couldn't be denied. Donald touched the deed in his pocket, thought of Mariah's quiet faith. Sometimes the strongest weapon was simply refusing to break. The town waited below them, unknowing. Donald squared his shoulders and pressed on. The real fight was about to begin. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Donald and Neshoba rode into town. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves, and townsfolk stopped to stare at the unlikely pair, the mountain man and the Apache warrior side by side. Some hurried inside shops and homes while others merely watched, uncertain. Donald guided his mule toward the white-painted church where Reverend Harlan would be preparing for tomorrow's service. The wooden steps creaked under their boots as they climbed to the church door. Inside, lamplight flickered against the plain walls and the scent of beeswax candles filled the air. Reverend Harlan looked up from his sermon notes, his weathered face creasing with concern. Donald, I heard about Mariah's arrest, but... His eyes fell on Neshoba, and he stood quickly. Welcome to God's house, sir. Neshoba inclined his head respectfully. You are the one who speaks of peace. I try to, though some refuse to hear. The preacher gestured to the simple wooden pews. Please, sit. Tell me everything. Donald's words tumbled out. The burning of his barn, Mariah's arrest on false charges, and now his cabin reduced to ashes. His hands shook as he described finding the smoking ruins. Maddox means to break us before the circuit preacher arrives, but we have something he doesn't expect. He pulled out the water-stained letters and deeds, spreading them on the preacher's lectern. These aren't just legal papers. They're a mother's last words to her daughter, her story, her love. He looked up at Reverend Harlan. The whole town needs to hear them. The preacher studied the papers, then nodded slowly. Tomorrow is Sunday service. Everyone will be here, even Maddox, keeping up appearances. He straightened, decision made. We'll let truth speak for itself. The sheriff may not allow Mariah to attend, Donald warned. Leave that to me, Reverend Harlan said. Mrs. Peterson and the other churchwomen have been visiting her, bringing food and comfort. They're none too pleased with how she's been treated. He smiled slightly. I believe they'll help spread word about tomorrow's special service. As if summoned by his words, the church door opened. Mrs. Peterson herself entered, followed by 2 other women from the Ladies' Aid Society. They paused at the sight of Neshoba, but Mrs. Peterson recovered quickly. Well, she said briskly, about time someone stood up to Clay Maddox. That poor girl's been nothing but polite, and him spreading tales about her being a thief. She turned to Donald. We've been praying for you both, Mr. Braddock. Though I reckon you could use some earthly help too. The women set to work immediately, dispatching messages throughout town. One went to fetch extra chairs, expecting a crowd. Another brought food from the boarding house to the parsonage where Donald and Neshoba would stay the night. As darkness fell, Donald paced the small guest room, unable to rest. The weight of tomorrow pressed on him. Everything depended on his words, his ability to make people see truth through Maddox's lies. He wasn't a speaker. He'd spent years avoiding people, not persuading them. Moonlight spilled through the window, reminding him of nights watching Mariah pray. Awkwardly, he knelt beside the narrow bed. Lord, he whispered, I ain't much for talking to you. But Mariah believes, and I reckon I need help. His throat tightened. Not for me. For her. For justice. Show me how to speak your truth tomorrow. The night passed slowly. Donald dozed fitfully, waking often to check the window. In the next room, he could hear Neshoba's quiet movements as the Apache warrior kept his own vigil. Dawn painted the sky pink and gold. Church bells rang across town, calling people to worship. Donald stood before the small mirror, straightening his worn shirt. He'd borrowed a razor from Reverend Harlan, trying to look respectable. The face that looked back seemed older, more careworn than he remembered. The church filled quickly. Word had spread about something important happening, drawing even those who usually skipped services. Farmers in clean shirts sat beside shopkeepers in Sunday suits. Women in their best dresses, wesiberer or dandasiwer, aber whispered behind gloved hands. The churchwomen had positioned themselves strategically throughout the congregation, ready to support their cause. Donald's heart pounded as he watched from the side door. Neshoba stood silent beside him, a steady presence. They had agreed he would stay near the back, his dignity a reminder of promises made and broken. A stir at the door made Donald look up. Clay Maddox swaggered in, flanked by 3 ranch hands. They wore guns despite it being church, a deliberate show of force. Maddox's eyes swept the room, narrowing when they fell on Donald. He led his men to a pew near the front, spreading out as if claiming territory. The sheriff arrived next, looking uncomfortable. Behind him came 2 deputies, escorting Mariah. Donald's chest tightened at the sight of her. She was pale and thinner after days in jail, but her head was high. The silver cross gleamed at her throat, and she'd somehow kept her mother's shawl clean. The deputies led her to a pew near the front, keeping close guard. Reverend Harlan stepped to the pulpit, and the murmuring congregation fell silent. Brothers and sisters, he began, we gather today not just for regular worship, but to hear truth that has too long been buried. He gestured to Donald. Mr. Braddock has something to share. Donald's legs felt wooden as he walked to the pulpit. His hands trembled as he set down the iron box, the letters, the deed. The whole church seemed to hold its breath. Many of you know part of this story, he said, his voice rough, about a deed found in a tree, about water rights and legal claims. He gripped the pulpit edge. But that ain't the real story. The real story is about a mother's love, about promises made before God, about a young girl's rightful inheritance, not just to land, but to dignity itself. He looked out at the sea of faces, some hostile, some curious, some already softening. In the front pew, Mariah's eyes shone with unshed tears as she clutched her mother's cross. Donald picked up the first letter with careful fingers. The moment of truth had come. Everything, Mariah's future, justice itself, hung on what happened next. In the weighted silence, he began to read. Donald's weathered hands held the first letter carefully, as if cradling something precious. Morning light streamed through the church windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The congregation sat silent, waiting. My dearest daughter Mariah, Donald began reading, his voice rough with emotion. If you are hearing these words, then God has called me home. But he has also sent someone to help you. Trust in his timing. The mother's words painted a picture of love that transcended boundaries. She wrote of holding baby Mariah for the first time, marveling at her perfect fingers and toes, of teaching her both the Lord's Prayer and Apache healing songs, of watching her grow strong and kind despite the prejudices she faced. You are not half of anything, my precious girl, Donald read, his voice growing stronger. You are whole and complete, carrying the best of both your father's people and mine. The silver cross you wear belonged to my grandmother. It represents not just our faith but our family's right to this land. Mariah's tears fell silently as she clutched the cross at her throat. Several churchwomen dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, touched by the mother's words. The deed I leave you is legal and true, Donald continued. Your grandfather purchased this land fairly, and I inherited it rightfully. The river water rights belong to you, Mariah, by law and by blood. I pray whoever finds these letters will stand as witness to this truth. Reverend Harlan stepped forward, holding up the deed. I have examined this document thoroughly, he declared. It bears the territorial seal and proper signatures. The dates and claims are legitimate. Legitimate? Maddox's voice cut through the quiet like a whip crack. He stood, face flushed with anger. That's nothing but clever forgery. You expect us to believe some half-breed girl has rights to the best water in the valley? Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the church at his crude words. Mrs. Peterson rose from her pew, her normally gentle face stern with righteous anger. I remember that child and her mother, she said clearly. They came to church here 5 years ago before the fever took her mama. That same silver cross hung around her mother's neck then, just as it does on Mariah now. Other churchwomen stood one by one. I remember too, said Mrs. Miller. The mother bought bread at our store. Paid fair and square, always polite. She helped tend my garden when I was sick, added Mrs. Thompson. Taught me which herbs would bring down fever. That girl is her mother's daughter, sure enough. Reverend Harlan lifted the silver cross from its resting place on the pulpit. Sunlight caught it, sending bright reflections dancing across the walls. This cross bears an inscription, he said. A date from 1842 and a family name matching the deed. The sheriff shifted in his seat, his face troubled. Donald had never seen the man look so uncomfortable in his own skin. Sheriff Crane, Reverend Harlan said quietly, you've held an innocent girl in jail on charges of theft. What evidence did you have? The church fell silent, all eyes on the lawman. Sheriff Crane stood slowly, removing his hat. His voice was barely audible. There wasn't any evidence, Mr. Maddox said. Said what? The preacher pressed. That you should jail a child to help him steal her rightful inheritance? The sheriff's shoulders sagged. The theft charges were false, he admitted. I knew it wasn't right, but I was afraid. A low rumble of angry mutters swept through the congregation. Maddox looked around wildly, seeing support crumbling. His hired men began edging away from him, reading the mood of the crowd. Now see here, Maddox blustered, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. This is about more than some piece of paper. That water means survival for my cattle operation. You can't expect. We expect justice, Clay Maddox. Reverend Harlan's voice rang with authority. "The same justice you'd demand if someone tried to steal your own daughter's inheritance. The same justice God commands us to uphold for the orphan and the widow." Donald watched as Maddox's face worked through confusion, anger, and finally, fear. The rancher's hired men had retreated to the back of the church, unwilling to stand against an entire town awakened to truth. "This ain't over," Maddox growled, but the threat sounded hollow. He turned and stalked toward the door, his boot heels striking the wooden floor like angry exclamation points. Nobody moved to stop him. His men slipped out after him, heads down. In the sudden quiet, Donald picked up the last letter. His voice was gentle as he read the final words of a dying mother to her beloved daughter. "Mariah, my precious child, remember that you are never alone. Your father's strength and my love flow in your veins. The land knows you belong to it, just as you know in your heart that you belong to God. Keep faith, little one. Hold fast to truth. Love will find its way home." The letter trembled in Donald's hands as he finished. Mariah's soft sobs echoed in the hushed church. Mrs. Peterson moved to sit beside her, wrapping a motherly arm around her shoulders. The sheriff stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Miss Mariah," he said, "you're free to go." I'm sorry for what was done to you." Reverend Harlan held out the silver cross to Mariah. She rose and walked to the front of the church, her steps steady despite her tears. As she took the cross, sunlight streamed through the windows, surrounding her in a gentle glow. The sight touched something deep in every heart present, a reminder that God's truth, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The townspeople began to stir, turning to their neighbors, speaking in low voices about what they had witnessed. The churchwomen gathered around Mariah, offering comfort and congratulations. Donald stood quietly at the pulpit, knowing his part was done. The letters had spoken their truth. The town had chosen justice over fear. Through the open church doors, morning light spilled across the threshold like a promise of new beginnings. The letters lay on the pulpit, their water-stained pages finally at rest, their message delivered. A mother's love had reached across years to protect her daughter. Truth had found its voice at last. Sheriff Crane's keys jangled as he unlocked the heavy iron cell door. The metallic clang echoed through the jail as the door swung open. Mariah stood there for a moment, her thin frame silhouetted against the shadows. Then with the tears streaming down her face, she rushed forward. "Father!" The word burst from her heart as she threw herself into Donald's waiting arms. "Father!" Donald's breath caught in his throat. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as his own eyes grew misty. The simple word, "Father," filled an empty space in his heart he had thought would stay hollow forever. His voice was rough with emotion as he stroked her dark hair. "I'm here, little one. I'm here." From across the room, Clay Maddox's face twisted with rage. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "Can't what?" Neshoba's quiet voice cut through Maddox's bluster. The Apache warrior stepped forward, his scarred face dignified in the late morning light streaming through the jailhouse windows. "Cannot let justice prevail? Cannot let a child claim her rightful inheritance?" Maddox whirled around, seeking support, but found none. The townsfolk who had witnessed the truth in church stood firm, their faces set against his anger. Even his hired men had melted away, unwilling to stand against an entire community united in purpose. "The Apache people remember our promises," Neshoba continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "We remember those who deal falsely, and those who deal true. My niece has both our protection and our blessing. Think carefully before you move against her again." Donald stepped forward, still keeping one arm around Mariah's shoulders. "She'll be raised with respect for both her heritages," he said to Neshoba. "I give you my word on that. She'll know the prayers of her mother and the wisdom of her father's people." Neshoba inclined his head, a small smile touching his lips. "I believe you, Donald Braddock. You have proven yourself a true father to her already." Maddox's face had grown purple with fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. "That water means life or death for my cattle. You'll regret this, all of you." He stormed toward the door, spurs jingling angrily with each step. No one moved to stop him. His threats fell flat in the face of truth revealed and justice served. The banker, Samuel Lyle, who had been standing quietly in the corner, straightened his vest and slipped out after Maddox. His usual smooth manner was cracked by humiliation. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, a small gathering assembled in Reverend Harlan's parsonage. The preacher's housekeeper had laid out a simple supper of bread, stew, and apple pie. Donald, Mariah, Neshoba, and Reverend Harlan sat around the well-worn table, steam rising from their bowls. Mariah offered a quiet prayer of thanks, her silver cross catching the lamplight. Donald bowed his head, peace settling over him for the first time in years. Yes, there would be challenges ahead. His cabin needed rebuilding after Maddox's men burned it. The riverland would need proper fencing and care, but none of that seemed insurmountable now. "We'll help with the rebuilding," Reverend Harlan said, as if reading Donald's thoughts. "The congregation will pitch in. It's the least we can do to make things right. And I will bring some of our young men to assist," Neshoba added. "We can raise a good cabin before the deep snow comes." Donald nodded gratefully, too moved to speak. Mariah reached over and squeezed his hand. Their eyes met in understanding. They were family now, bound by something stronger than blood. Through the parsonage windows they could see snow beginning to fall. Fat, white flakes drifted down in the gathering dusk, transforming the town's muddy streets into pristine blankets of white. The soft, shushing sound of snow seemed to whisper peace over the day's turmoil. Inside, the lamp burned warm and bright as they shared their meal. Each person around that humble table knew they were part of something profound. Not just the righting of a wrong, but the forging of new bonds that crossed the boundaries of race and culture. In the quiet company of friends who had become family, Donald felt his heart truly beginning to heal. Over the next days, the sound of hammers and saws filled the crisp mountain air. Donald's burned cabin site became alive with activity as townsfolk gathered to help rebuild. Men hauled fresh-cut pine timbers up the trail, while churchwomen arrived with baskets of food and stacks of warm blankets. Mariah moved among them with quiet pride, her thin arms straining as she carried smooth river stones for the new hearth. Her determination touched the workers, who smiled and made space for her contributions. Some of the same women who had bought her the shawl now brought extra portions of stew, watching with satisfaction as she grew stronger day by day. Neshoba rode up frequently from the Apache camp, his horse's hooves crunching through the early frost. He would sit with Mariah, speaking softly in Apache, teaching her the words of her father's people. Donald listened to their musical language, seeing how Mariah's eyes brightened at these connections to her heritage. In the evenings, Neshoba would talk with Donald about honor and responsibility, sharing wisdom earned through years of bridging two worlds. These quiet conversations helped Donald understand how to guide Mariah's path through both her cultures. The walls of the cabin rose steadily, each log notched and fitted with care. Donald found himself working alongside men he had avoided for years, sharing coffee during breaks, accepting their help with gratitude. The weight of his long isolation began to lift as he felt himself becoming part of the community again. One afternoon, Sheriff Crane rode up alone. He dismounted slowly, his usual swagger replaced by humility. "I failed in my duty," he said to Donald, hat in hand. "I let Maddox pressure me into ignoring what was right." Donald studied the sheriff's face, seeing genuine regret. "A man can learn from his mistakes," he replied quietly. "Just make sure you stand for fairness from here on." As dusk approached on the 5th day, Donald carefully hung the silver cross above the newly built hearthbeam. The last rays of sunlight caught the metal, making it gleam. Mariah stood beside him, her hand slipping into his as she whispered a prayer of thanks in both English and Apache. That night they slept in the half-finished cabin, wrapped in the thick quilts the churchwomen had brought. Though the walls were not yet chinked and the roof only partially shingled, they felt warmer than any fire could make them. They had found something greater than shelter. They had found belonging. Spring came to the Colorado Highlands with gentle persistence. The river swelled with snowmelt, its waters rushing clear and strong past Donald's rebuilt cabin. Tender green shoots pushed through the dark soil where Donald and Mariah had cleared a patch for their garden. Neshoba rode up one mild morning, his saddlebags heavy with seed pouches wrapped in deerskin. He dismounted with careful dignity, greeting them both before spreading the seeds on a blanket. Corn, beans, and squash passed down through generations of Apache gardens. "These plants grow together," he explained to Mariah, showing her how to mound the earth. "Like family, they help each other grow strong." Mariah knelt beside her uncle in the fresh-turned soil, her hands moving in the gestures he taught her. Her voice joined his in the ancient planting prayers, the words carrying on the spring breeze. Donald watched from nearby, seeing how naturally she moved between both worlds of her heritage. In town, the change was subtle but steady. Where once there had been turned backs and whispers, now came cautious nods of greeting. Children who had once taunted Mariah now called her to join their games in the churchyard after Sunday service. The church women spoke of her as our girl, their voices warm with protective pride. Donald felt his chest swell watching her acceptance grow. He remembered the lonely child he had found by the river, and marveled at how she bloomed under care and respect. One bright afternoon, Reverend Harlan arrived with the circuit preacher, who had finally returned to their district. They spread the deed papers on Donald's new table, examining every detail with careful eyes. "It is all in order," the circuit preacher declared, adding his official seal. "This land belongs to Mariah, by right and law." That evening, Donald and Mariah sat together on the rough-hewn porch, watching the river flow past their land. The water caught the sunset light, glowing like molten gold. "I thought God had forgotten me," Donald said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But his mercy was waiting all along, hidden in that tree." Mariah leaned against his shoulder, the silver cross gleaming at her throat. "Mother always said her prayers would be answered," she whispered. "She said God would send someone to be my father." The river rushed on below them, strong and free, while overhead the first stars began to shine. The cabin stood restored against the summer twilight, its fresh-hewn logs golden in the evening light. Smoke curled from the chimney as neighbors gathered for a shared feast, their plates heaped with tender venison, warm bread, and wild berries picked that morning. Children darted between the adults, their laughter ringing across the yard. Nashoba sat at the head of the outdoor table, his weathered face peaceful as townsfolk sought his wisdom about the land and seasons. The same folk who had once turned away now listened with respect, nodding at his quiet words. Inside the cabin, Donald's voice rose and fell with stories of mountain life, of survival, and grace found in unexpected places. Mariah sat beside him, her eyes bright with pride as she watched her two worlds blend into one community. The silver cross above the hearth caught the lamplight, casting gentle shadows that danced across the walls. As the last guests waved goodbye under the rising moon, Donald and Mariah knelt together by the warm hearth. Their whispered prayers mixed with the crackling fire. Thanks for second chances, for the gift of family, for courage to stand firm when it mattered most. "Father," Mariah said softly, her hand finding his. The word filled Donald's heart to bursting, healing the last empty places grief had hollowed out. Through the open door they could see the old pine stump where it all began. Tender green shoots sprouted from its weathered surface, reaching toward the sky. Like their makeshift family, new life had taken root in unexpected soil, growing stronger with each passing day. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.